There is a berry growing wild across 48 states right now that contains 14 times more lycopene than a tomato. Not twice as much, 14 times. A single cup delivers more of the compound that protects cells from cancer than an entire basket of hothouse tomatoes. It also fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere, healing depleted soil without fertilizer, performing a biochemical miracle that modern agriculture cannot replicate at any price. For 70 years, the United States government paid farmers to plant it on eroded land from Pennsylvania to Oregon. Then, in the 1990s, they reversed course. They declared it invasive. They funded eradication programs. They paid landowners to rip it out by the roots, and the $8 billion tomato processing industry never said a word. What they did not tell you is that this berry saved thousands of American families from starvation during the Dust Bowl, when commercial crops failed and the science proving its nutritional superiority has been published in peer-reviewed journals for decades. This is the autumn olive berry, and this is the story of how America turned its back on one of the most nutritionally complete wild foods ever documented. The autumn olive berry does not look like it could save your life. It is a small speckled fruit, silver red, and dotted with scales, about the size of a pea. It grows in massive clusters on silvery-leaved shrubs that thrive in the worst soil you can imagine: roadside gravel, abandoned strip mines, clear cuts, disturbed ground where nothing else will grow. And for nearly a century, that resilience made it essential. During the Great Depression, as industrial agriculture collapsed and topsoil blew away in black clouds that darkened the sky from Texas to Canada, rural families watched their orchards die. Apple trees withered. Peach trees failed. Commercial fruit disappeared from markets or became so expensive that working families could not afford it. Children in Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Great Plains developed scurvy symptoms not seen since the age of sailing ships. Autumn olive did not care about the Dust Bowl. It survived. It fruited. And the families who knew how to harvest it made it through seasons when nothing else would grow. They dried the berries and stored them in cloth sacks. They boiled them into preserves. They mixed them into cornbread batter to stretch rations. They gave them to children who had not seen fresh fruit in months. This was not folklore. This was survival. By the 1930s, the Soil Conservation Service understood what those families had learned through desperation. Autumn olive could stabilize eroded slopes, rebuild nitrogen-depleted soil, and produce edible fruit on land so degraded that even weeds struggled. The government began distributing seedlings by the thousands. Conservation officers planted them along highways to prevent erosion. Farmers planted them as windbreaks and living fences. Veterans returning from war planted them on homesteads carved from exhausted farmland. The plant performed exactly as promised. It grew fast, stabilized soil, thrived in drought, and every autumn produced cascading clusters of bright red berries that fed everything from songbirds to black bears. For decades, it was considered a conservation success story. Then something shifted. By the 1990s, the same agencies that had distributed millions of seedlings began calling autumn olive a threat. It spread too aggressively. It crowded out native species. It formed dense thickets in forests and pastures. State after state added it to invasive species lists. The USDA authorized removal programs. Environmental grants funded eradication efforts across 18 states. Landowners were paid to cut, burn, and poison autumn olive stands that their grandparents had planted at the government's instruction. The official reason was ecological. The plant was non-native, originally from Asia, and it outcompeted indigenous vegetation. All of that was true, but the timing tells a different story. The same decades that saw autumn olive reclassified as a pest saw the explosive consolidation of industrial agriculture and the rise of the processed tomato industry into an $8 billion global enterprise. Tomatoes became the dominant source of lycopene in the American diet, marketed relentlessly for their antioxidant content, their cancer-fighting compounds, their heart-protective benefits. Every bottle of ketchup, every jar of marinara sauce, every health claim on every label in the produce aisle reinforced a single message: if you want lycopene, you buy tomatoes. There was another option. It was growing on the hillside. It required no irrigation, no pesticides, no fertilizer, no fossil fuel inputs of any kind. And it contained 14 times more lycopene per gram than the crop that entire supply chains were built to process. They ripped it out. The science showing what autumn olive berries can do is not hidden in obscure journals or dismissed by the research community. It is published, peer-reviewed, and replicated across institutions. A study from Cornell University measured lycopene content in autumn olive berries at 17 milligrams per 100 grams of fresh fruit. Compare that to tomatoes at 1.2 milligrams. That is a 14-fold difference, a nutritional gap so wide it places the two foods in entirely separate categories. But lycopene is only the beginning. Autumn olive berries contain 18 amino acids, including all 9 essential amino acids that the human body cannot produce and must obtain from food. They contain vitamins A, C, and E in concentrations that rival purpose-grown superfoods sold at premium prices in health stores. They contain flavonoids, carotenoids, and phenolic compounds that act as potent antioxidants, scavenging free radicals and reducing oxidative stress at the cellular level. A single serving delivers more vitamin E than a handful of almonds, more vitamin A than a carrot, more antioxidant capacity than a cup of blueberries. What makes autumn olive truly extraordinary is not any single nutrient, but the biological system it performs while producing that fruit. The plant forms symbiotic relationships with soil bacteria in structures called root nodules. These bacteria pull nitrogen directly from the air and convert it into a form plants can use, a process called nitrogen fixation. This is not a minor agricultural footnote. This is one of the most important biochemical reactions in the living world. Industrial farming depends on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer manufactured using the Haber-Bosch process, which consumes roughly 2% of global energy production and generates massive carbon emissions. Autumn olive performs the same function for free, healing soil while it grows. It does not deplete the land. It rebuilds it. And then there is the research that never made it to the front page. In 2008, researchers at Rutgers University published findings showing that autumn olive extract inhibited the proliferation of human prostate cancer cells in laboratory conditions. The bioactive compounds disrupted cancer cell growth while leaving healthy cells unaffected. Subsequent studies identified specific flavonoids in the berries that demonstrated anti-tumor activity in multiple cancer cell lines. A naturally occurring compound in a fruit that grows wild on roadsides showed measurable anti-cancer properties in controlled laboratory settings. So why is this berry not being studied in clinical trials? Why is it not in every hospital nutrition program, every cancer research protocol, every preventive health initiative? Why are we funding programs to eradicate the plant instead of programs to harvest the fruit? The answer is the same as it always is. There is no profit in a solution people can gather for free. You cannot patent a wild berry. You cannot trademark a plant that grows on public land. You cannot build a pharmaceutical supply chain around something that propagates itself, requires no inputs, and produces fruit whether anyone tends it or not. But we already know what happens when a population takes autumn olives seriously, because immigrant communities across the United States never stopped using it. In Korean, Chinese, and Japanese communities, autumn olive berries are still harvested every fall, processed into preserves, dried for winter storage, and used in traditional dishes that have been passed down for generations. Home cooks make autumn olive jam, autumn olive tea, autumn olive sauce for grilled meat. Herbalists prepare tinctures and extracts used in traditional medicine. These communities did not need a government program or a marketing campaign to tell them the berries were valuable. They remembered, and in parts of rural Appalachia, where knowledge of wild foraging never entirely disappeared, older generations still gather autumn olive berries in late September and October, following the same rhythms their grandparents followed during the Depression. They know which hillsides produce the sweetest fruit. They know how to process out the seeds. They know that a single afternoon of harvesting can yield enough preserved fruit to last through winter. That knowledge survived economic collapse, industrial consolidation, and decades of official discouragement. Now, it is available to anyone willing to learn. You can identify autumn olive by its distinctive silvery leaves, speckled berries, and thorny branches. The fruit ripens in autumn, usually September through October depending on latitude. You can eat them fresh, though they are tart and astringent. You can cook them into jam or syrup. You can dry them and grind them into powder for smoothies. You can freeze them whole and use them year-round. A 10-minute walk through any overgrown field, abandoned lot, or roadside thicket in the eastern United States will likely reveal more autumn olive than you could harvest in an afternoon. The plant is still there. It survived the eradication programs. It survived being classified as a pest. It survived being erased from the American food system. It is waiting for you to remember what your great-grandparents knew during the hardest years this country ever faced. You do not need permission. You do not need to buy it. You do not need a subscription service or a supplement company to access one of the most nutrient-dense wild foods in North America. You just need to know where to look.